My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 82 years old, and for most of my life I thought family was my anchor. I worked hard, raised my children on a small pension after my husband passed, and poured everything into making sure my son, Richard, had opportunities one never dreamed of. I believed that loyalty, that sacrifice, would one day come back to me in the form of warmth, holidays together, and grandchildren running through my house. But I was wrong. Last December, just a week before Christmas, my phone rang. I thought it was Richard calling to confirm the plans. I had already put up a small tree in the corner of my living room, the same ornaments I had kept for decades, each one carrying a memory. Instead, it was his wife, Margaret. Her voice was sharp, her words delivered like they were rehearsed. Eleanor, this year, we think it's best if you don't come to Christmas. The children need a calm holiday, and honestly, you make things tense. I felt my chest tighten. My hearing is not what it used to be, but those words cut clearer than any blade. I sat in my recliner, holding the phone, unable to breathe for a moment. Me, the one who made things tense. I remembered the years I spent sewing Richard's costumes for school plays, the nights I stayed up with him during fevers, the winters I skipped meals so he would have enough. And now, at 82, I was being told I was unwelcome. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I stayed silent. But the silence was not peace. It was rejection, a loneliness that crawled into my bones. I pressed the phone to my chest after she hung up, staring at the twinkling lights on my tree. Each bulb flickered like a reminder of everything I had lost. Christmas was supposed to be family. Instead, I was left with a plate of cold leftovers and the sound of the neighbors' laughter drifting through my thin walls. But something inside me shifted that night. A voice whispered that this was not just about Christmas. This was about respect, dignity, and how easily an old woman could be erased from her own family's story. And in that silence, I made a decision. What I decided is the part of the story you won't want to miss. The morning after that call, I woke up to the sound of my old radiator clicking and hissing in my little apartment. The December cold had a way of settling into my bones. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the faded photo of my late husband, Charles, on the nightstand. His smile still had that same mischief he carried when we met in the summer of 1959 at a county fair. Charles was the kind of man who made promises and kept them. He promised me a life of love, even if we didn't have much, and he gave it to me until his heart gave out one bitter January morning 20 years ago. Since then, the winters had been lonelier, but I had Richard. At least I thought I did. I made my way to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and let the steam rise against my face. That's when the memories began to press down on me. Memories of every Christmas past. I saw myself, younger and full of energy, working double shifts at the diner so Richard could have a new bicycle. I saw Charles carrying boxes of decorations from the attic, whistling carols off-key while Richard clapped his little hands in joy. I saw the living room filled with neighbors, friends, and the smell of Charles's famous roast beef. Back then, my home was the heart of the neighborhood. But over the years, people drifted away. Friends passed on. The neighborhood changed. And now, the family I sacrificed everything for had cast me aside like some old ornament too faded to hang on the tree. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about Margaret. She was polished, educated, from a family that looked down their noses at small-town women like me. I tried to win her over in the beginning, but there was always a wall. I could feel it the first time I hugged her, and her body stiffened like my arms were poison. I told myself she would soften once children came. But when my grandchildren were born, she guarded them like they were hers alone. She let me hold them, yes, but never too long. Never without her watchful eyes. I tried to ignore it. I swallowed my pride. I smiled even when it hurt. But now I see it clearly. This wasn't just about Christmas. Margaret wanted me gone. She wanted to erase my presence from Richard's life altogether. I sat at my kitchen table, tracing the rim of my mug with trembling fingers. The silence of the apartment pressed down on me. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder. Had I lived my whole life just to end up alone? But then, Another thought came. Small spark buried deep. Maybe Margaret didn't know everything. Maybe Richard didn't either. Families carry secrets. And I had mine. Secrets strong enough to break through the silence. When people see an old woman, they think her life has already been lived. They don't see the years of choices, the dreams traded away, the battles fought in silence. But I remember every detail. I was just 19 when Richard was born. Back then, Charles and I lived in a tiny one-bedroom house on the edge of a small town in Ohio. He worked at the steel mill, his hands always blistered and blackened, and I worked nights at a diner, balancing trays heavier than my body. We didn't have much, but we had love. And I thought love would be enough. Then the accident happened. The mill explosion. Charles was lucky to come home alive, but he never worked the same again. His lungs filled with dust, and his cough never left him. So I stepped in. Became the provider. I worked 3 jobs. Cleaning houses, waitressing, sewing clothes for neighbors. I did it all with a smile because Richard deserved a chance. I still remember one winter night, when the furnace went out and snow leaked through the thin walls. Richard was only 6, and he was shivering under blankets. I had no money for repairs. So I bundled him up, sat him in the kitchen, and left the oven door open all night just to keep him warm. I didn't sleep. I watched him breathe, afraid the cold would steal him away if I closed my eyes. That became my life. A long string of sacrifices, little pieces of myself I gave away so my son could have a future. When college came, I told Richard to go, even though it meant I would be alone with Charles's failing health. I pawned my wedding ring to help pay for his tuition. I never told him. I never told anyone. And when Charles passed, I still smiled at Richard's graduation. I clapped louder than anyone else, even though my heart was breaking. I told myself it was worth it, that one day when he had his own family, he would look at me and say, "Mom, you gave me everything. Now let me give back to you." But life didn't turn out that way. Instead, I found myself staring at a locked door every time I visited his new house. Margaret always answered first, her face tight, her voice clipped. She never asked me inside without hesitation. The sacrifices I made became invisible to her, like they had evaporated into thin air. Still I kept my silence. I thought love would be enough. But love without respect is just another form of hunger. And I had been starving for years. What Margaret doesn't know, what Richard has forgotten, is that my sacrifices came with a price. And that price carries a secret. One that could shake this family to its core. The truth is, every sacrifice leaves a scar. And behind my smile, I carried one that no one ever saw. It was 1968, the year Richard turned 9. Charles's health had worsened. His lungs rattled with every breath, and the medical bills stacked higher than the ceiling. I was drowning. The diner barely paid enough to keep food on the table, and the sewing jobs dried up after a factory opened in town. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, staring at an empty cupboard, my son asleep in the next room, whispering to myself, "I can't do this anymore." That week, a man named Walter showed up at the diner. He was older, a businessman from Columbus, the kind of man who wore silk ties when everyone else wore work boots. He noticed me struggling and offered help. At first, it was small. He paid for Charles's medicine when I couldn't. He slipped me cash to cover the rent. I told myself it was charity, kindness from a stranger. But it wasn't. Walter expected something in return. And one night, desperate and ashamed, I gave in. I told myself it was just once. Just one mistake to keep my family alive. But mistakes have a way of echoing through time. A few months later, when I found out I was pregnant, I knew the child was not Charles's. I made a decision then that changed everything. I couldn't keep the baby. I arranged quietly, through a church friend, for adoption. No one ever knew. Not Charles, not Richard. I carried that secret like a stone in my chest. For years I convinced myself it was buried. But sometimes late at night I hear a voice in my head, "Mama," and I wonder what became of that child. Did they grow up happy? Did they ever search for me? Did they know they were born out of desperation, not love? That's the secret I've lived with all these years. The secret I never spoke aloud. And now, as Margaret tries to erase me from Richard's life, I realize something. The only power I still hold is the truth I never told. A truth that could unravel the picture-perfect family she's trying so hard to protect. But revealing it would mean breaking Richard's heart. The question is, will I stay silent or will I finally speak? It was New Year's Eve, just a few days after I had been banned from Christmas. The town was alive with fireworks and laughter, but my apartment sat in silence. I tried to distract myself by watching the ball drop on television, but every cheer from the crowd in Times Square only reminded me of the empty chair across my table. That night, I poured myself a glass of ginger ale, raised it toward Charles's old photograph and whispered, "Happy New Year, love." My voice cracked, and before I could stop myself, tears spilled down my cheeks. 82 years of strength of swallowing pain, and still I felt like that young woman again, standing in the kitchen with nothing but empty cupboards and fear. And then the phone rang. My heart leapt. I thought maybe Richard had changed his mind. But when I picked up, it wasn't him. It was Margaret. Her voice was colder than the winter air outside. "Eleanor, I hope you understand that Richard and the children need stability. This is for the best. You should move on. Move on." As if I were some piece of old furniture to be carried to the curb and forgotten. Something inside me snapped that night. I felt the years of silence, the decades of sacrifice, the hidden secret I had carried pressing against my chest. For the first time I didn't swallow my pain. I let my voice rise. "You listen to me, Margaret," I said, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. "You may think you know this family, but you don't know half of it. I have stayed quiet for Richard's sake, but you need to understand. I am not the weak old woman you think I am. There are things you don't know. Things that could change everything." There was silence on the line. For the first time, Margaret didn't have a ready reply. She hung up without a word. But her silence told me I had struck something deep. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair, staring at the twinkling lights on my tree, the same tree that had witnessed my heartbreak just days earlier. Only this time I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The truth I had buried for decades was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. And I knew sooner or later it would come out. 2 weeks passed after that phone call, and I heard nothing from Richard. The silence was worse than Margaret's words. It was as if my own son had vanished, as if the woman I raised him to be loyal to had built a wall between us so high he couldn't even hear me calling. But then, on a gray Sunday morning, the phone finally rang again. It was Richard. His voice was hesitant, like he was balancing between love for his mother and fear of his wife. "Mom, Margaret thinks it would be good if you came by for dinner next week. Just to talk." My chest tightened. I had been banned from Christmas, but suddenly there was an invitation for dinner. It didn't take much to know Margaret had a plan. Still I agreed. Because sometimes, silence must give way to confrontation. When the day came, I dressed carefully. I wore Charles's old wool coat, patched at the elbows, and the string of pearls he had given me on our 25th anniversary. Not because I needed to impress them, but because I needed to remind myself of the woman I once was. Their house sat in one of those new suburban neighborhoods where every home looked the same, but Margaret had filled hers with shining glass and perfect furniture. I stepped inside, and the air smelled of lavender polish and something roasting in the oven. The children ran through the hallway, their laughter filling the space I was never allowed to enter freely. Richard gave me a half-smile, but his eyes looked tired. Margaret appeared a moment later, her dress neat, her hair perfectly pinned back. She didn't hug me. She simply said, "Eleanor, thank you for coming. Please sit." We gathered around the polished dining table. My hands trembled slightly as I held my fork, not from weakness but from the weight of what was coming. The small talk was strained. School updates about the children, Richard's long hours at work, Margaret's volunteer projects. But under it all, I could feel her watching me, waiting. Finally, she put down her wine glass and leaned forward. Eleanor, we all want peace in this family. But peace requires honesty. You said there were things I didn't know. Maybe now is the time to share them. The room went silent. Richard shifted in his chair, confused. The children froze, sensing the tension in the air. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought about swallowing the truth again, letting it rot inside me for another year. But then I remembered the Christmas rejection, the years of sacrifice, the secret that had haunted me since 1968. I looked at Richard, at the son I gave my life for, and I whispered, "You're right. It's time you knew." The fork slipped from Richard's hand, clattering against the plate. Margaret's eyes widened in anticipation. The children stared. I drew in a shaky breath. The truth was about to be spoken. And once I spoke it, nothing in this family would ever be the same again. I sat there at Margaret's polished dining table, my hands trembling slightly as I set my fork down. For more than 50 years I had kept this part of my life locked away, telling myself it was better left buried. But now, under Margaret's piercing stare and Richard's puzzled eyes, I knew silence was no longer an option. I cleared my throat, my voice low at first. "Richard, there's something I never told you. Something that happened when you were a boy." His brow furrowed. "Mom, what are you talking about?" The children were whispering. Margaret leaned forward. Her lips curled like she had been waiting for this moment. I closed my eyes and let the words spill out. "When your father got sick, money ran out. I was desperate. And in that desperation I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I turned to a man who offered to help, and I let him. I thought it would save us, and in some ways it did. But I got pregnant, Richard. The baby was not your father's." The air grew heavy, like all the oxygen had been drained from the room. Richard's fork clattered against his plate. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I gave that baby up," I whispered, tears sliding down my cheeks. "Through the church. No one ever knew. Not even your father. I carried that shame alone because I thought it would destroy our family. I never wanted you to feel less loved, less important. You were my world. You still are." The children were wide-eyed, their little hands frozen over their plates. Margaret's expression was sharp, almost victorious, like she had pulled the truth from me with her bare hands. Richard stood suddenly, pushing his chair back. His voice cracked with anger and disbelief. "All these years. You carried this and never told me." I tried to reach for his hand, but he pulled away. "I was protecting you," I said, my voice breaking. "I wanted you to have a clean story of your family, not the broken one I lived. Every sacrifice I made was for you. Every single one." Margaret finally spoke, her tone cutting. "This is exactly why I said what I said. Secrets destroy families, Eleanor. Maybe it's time you admit that your silence has done more harm than good." Her words hit like stones, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in decades, the truth was out of me, no longer eating away at my heart. Richard's face was pale. His eyes filled with something between anger and sorrow. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't look at the children. He just stared at me as though I had turned into a stranger. And in that moment, I realized the truth had set me free. But it might cost me the very son I had sacrificed everything for. Richard didn't speak to me for days after that dinner. When I called, he let the phone ring. When I stopped by, Margaret answered the door with that cold smile and told me Richard was too busy. My son, the boy I raised through hunger, through winters without heat, through nights of sacrifice, was slipping away from me. And I couldn't tell if it was Margaret's hand pulling him or the weight of my confession. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glow of the television. My tree still stood in the corner, its lights dim, ornaments dusty. I thought about Charles, about the promises I had made, about the baby I had given up. For a moment, I wondered if I had ruined everything by finally speaking. Then there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Richard stood there. His face looked older, his eyes tired, but his hands were empty. No wife, no children behind him. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what to do with what you told me. Hurt. God, it hurt. But I also can't forget who you've been all my life. You gave me everything. You never stopped being my mother. I felt my knees weaken. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. Margaret might never forgive me. She might even harden her grip on the family. But in that moment, I realized something powerful. The truth had not destroyed me, had freed me. I was no longer the silent, erased old woman sitting in the shadows. I was Eleanor Whitmore, flawed, scarred but unbroken. And Richard, no matter how far he strayed, could never erase the blood and the bond between us. Sometimes winning doesn't mean triumph over others. Sometimes it means reclaiming your dignity, even if the world wants to bury it. And that was my victory. If Eleanor's story touched you, subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories that will make you feel, think, and remember what really matters in life.